He was first seen just after dawn, staggering across a field of frost-bitten rye, barefoot and blood-slicked, the skin on his hands split and peeling like the bark of a dying tree. The farmer who spotted him said he didn't cry out or make a sound, just walked, one foot dragging, arms held out slightly from his sides, as if even the air hurt to touch. His face was blank, not dazed or lost, just empty. His mouth didn't open, his eyes didn't move. When the farmer called to him, the boy stopped but didn't turn. And when he collapsed, it was slow, almost polite, like a marionette laid carefully to rest. They took him to the parish infirmary where the nurses cleaned his wounds and tried to coax words from him. But he didn't speak, not once. He flinched when the door opened. He cowered when a bowl clanged. And when a nurse handed him a cup of water, he dropped it, hands trembling, eyes wide, as if he expected to be punished. His palms, doctors said, weren't just cut. They were scraped raw, as though he'd clawed something for hours, maybe days. The wounds had festered, but no infection had set in. Just pain, deep, internal, refusing to close. Nobody knew who he was at first. No town records matched his face. But one deputy remembered the Monroe children, quiet, strange, homeschooled, and said the boy looked like one of theirs. Maybe Daniel, maybe Tobias. It was hard to tell. The Monroes hadn't been seen in weeks. The family lived in a wooden house far down the tree line where the road narrowed into nothing. People rarely went there. The Monroes rarely left. They kept to themselves, polite but off. The kind of family that folded every napkin, bowed during prayer, and never stayed long after Sunday service. When the sheriff and his men reached the house 2 days later, the windows were shut, the chimney cold, and the door unlocked. Inside was not chaos. There were no signs of violence, no shattered glass, no overturned chairs. Instead, everything was neat, too neat. 4 bowls sat on the table, each filled with gray, congealed porridge. Cold, untouched. 4 sets of silverware. 4 chairs, each pushed in. Upstairs, the beds were made, tight as drumskin, quilts pressed flat. The rooms had no toys, no books, no drawings, no clothing smaller than a young teen's. The closets were bare, save for one folded white garment hung precisely at the center of each rod. The house had not been left in a hurry. It had been staged, like it had finished being lived in. Outside in the yard, snow covered most of the ground. But beneath the eaves of the woodshed, they found a trail of blood droplets in the dirt. Not a pool, not a smear, just a trail, leading nowhere, as if someone had bled standing still. The boy remained silent. For a time, the nurses thought he might recover. He ate when fed, slept through the night. But he never spoke, never wrote, never gestured. He kept his hands tucked beneath his blanket, even when they hurt. And one night, just before he died, he looked at the ceiling and mouthed a number. Not a word, not a name. Just 12. No other Monroe child was ever found. The boy was buried in the parish graveyard under a name no one could confirm. The coroner called it exposure. The sheriff called it tragedy. But the ones who'd seen inside that house, who'd stood in that stillness too perfect to be natural, called it something else. Something they didn't write down. Something they still hear in silence. The Monroe house was still when they arrived. Not abandoned, still. As if time had stopped inside its walls, not abruptly but by choice. The front door creaked open without resistance, and what greeted the investigators wasn't chaos or disarray, but perfect, sterile calm. The kind of quiet that doesn't invite questions, but dares you to ask them anyway. The air held no scent of food or wood smoke. No warmth lingered in the hearth. No echo of voices trailed through the rooms. It was a home without breath. At first glance, nothing seemed out of place. The table was set for 4. Plain bowls, stainless spoons, folded napkins, each one placed with unnatural care. The living room was orderly with no clutter, no scuffs on the floorboards, no prints on the windows. The curtains were thick and clean, drawn precisely to the edge of the frame. But then came the realization. There was nothing for a child. No toys, no trinkets, no scribbled drawings or mismatched socks or cracked picture books shoved between cushions. The kind of mess that follows youth had simply never existed here, or had been erased. Upstairs, the bedrooms repeated the same message. Identical beds with stiff white sheets, quilts folded with military precision. Not a single name scratched into a headboard, not a single forgotten slipper under the bed. The closets held only clothing fit for adolescence. Wool slacks, plain dresses, buttoned shirts. Every item hung like it had been weighed, measured, and passed inspection. There were no baby clothes, no soft fabrics, no bright colors. Nothing that hinted at play or growing. Childhood had not faded here. It had been carved out and removed. They searched deeper, expecting perhaps a trunk, a box, some corner that hadn't been curated, but even the attic was clean. Lined with crates sealed tight, their contents neatly labeled: linen, wax, salt, ash. None of it marked by a child's hand. No crayon scrawls, no hidden keepsakes, just inventory. Stored and stacked by someone who believed that things should be kept, but not remembered. In the pantry they found rows of jars, dried beans, pickled roots, hard loaves wrapped in cloth. Food that kept, food without flavor. A shelf near the back held tins of chalk, but no slates. Spools of thread, but no needles. Wax candles, but no matches. Things preserved out of habit, not need. And in a drawer beneath the bread box was a folded sheet of paper. On it, in tiny, careful print, "Noise invites confusion, joy invites decay." The deputies didn't speak for a long time. One of them, a young father, said quietly that he'd never been inside a house with children that didn't feel alive. Not noisy, not messy, just alive. This house felt embalmed, not just the absence of children, but the absence of anything that had ever been children. As if joy had been exorcised. In the final room they found a box of name tags, each one printed in block letters tied with string, stacked by date. The names matched the county's missing records. Dozens of children, all once believed to be homeschooled. None ever seen again past age 12. They stepped out into the fading light with more questions than answers. But one thing was certain. The Monroes had not merely hidden their children. They had hidden the fact of them. They had built a house where childhood was not allowed to live, where laughter was not forgotten, but forbidden, where toys were never lost, because they were never given in the first place. They found the hatch beneath the pantry, buried under a false bottom in the floorboards, sealed with hinges so rusted they snapped when pried. The boards above had been scrubbed, painted, covered again. Layers meant to hide, not forget. The opening led to a steep wooden stairwell just wide enough for one person at a time. The air below was dense and still, thick with the weight of something that hadn't moved in years. When they lit the lantern, it flickered unnaturally, like the flame itself didn't want to stay. The room at the bottom wasn't wide, but it was built with purpose. The walls were plain pine, bleached and cracked, with strange smudges near the corners, finger marks or footprints that hadn't been washed away, only rubbed dull. The temperature was wrong, too warm for winter, too dry for a cellar. In the center of the floor sat a copper basin embedded into the wood, ringed with burn marks and black stains that had long since seeped into the grain. Around it, evenly spaced, were 6 iron rings bolted into the floorboards, restraints, small, child-sized, each one worn smooth around the metal, the wood beneath dark and split from strain. They stood still, absorbing the space. Then they turned to the shelves. 3 of them lined the far wall, stacked with identical glass jars. dozens of them. Some held locks of hair, others tiny bones or bits of fabric curled tight and sealed in wax. Every jar bore a handwritten label, neat and deliberate. Each one had a name. Each name was followed by a number. None of the numbers went higher than 12. The children weren't just remembered here. They were catalogued. The jars were perfectly arranged, oldest to newest, forming a kind of archive no one wanted to touch. A few had dates, others only initials. One simply read LM, 12 with a small crimson ribbon curled inside. Another held a paper scrap with the word silent, written in childish block letters. The handwriting wasn't Alma's, it was theirs. Pieces of the children, kept sealed, arranged like pieces of a ritual performed again and again with no question, no hesitation, no mercy. The floor around the basin told its own story. Scratches radiated out in all directions, some deep, others shallow, as if scraped by fingernails or heels dragged in resistance. The deputies who stepped too close all said the same thing afterward. It felt watched, not haunted, not cursed. Watched, as if the room itself had learned how to see. In the corner was a stool and a table, low to the ground, built to face the shelves. A set of thin iron tools rested on top, picks, hooks, measuring wires. Each one clean, each one clearly used. Next to them was a book bound in black cloth and sealed with a wax emblem that had been broken long ago. Inside were rows of entries. Names, numbers, the word emptied. Written in ink that had dried like rust. This was no nursery, this was a process, a final room. A place where childhood was removed and sorted. Where something pure was believed to be extracted before it could turn rotten. The restraints were not for punishment, they were for procedure, and the jars weren't trophies, they were remains. Preserved not out of love, but control. When the team emerged, no one spoke. The hatch was left open. They couldn't bring themselves to seal it again. It had been hidden for years, buried in silence. But now that it had been found, it felt like something had exhaled from below, something careful, something patient. And upstairs, in that quiet, empty house, the stillness felt heavier than before, like the room beneath had always been there. Waiting. The barn stood crooked behind the Monroe house, its walls sagging inward as if collapsing under secrets too long buried. The search team hadn't planned to enter it that day. There were more urgent questions beneath the house. But one deputy walking the perimeter noticed a pattern of shallow grooves etched into the frame of the door. Not initials, not whittling, something rhythmic. Tally marks in sets of 12. They broke the lock with a crowbar, and the moment the door swung open, the temperature shifted. Not colder, cleaner, as if the air inside had been untouched, preserved. The space held the expected: old tools, dried feed, crates stacked high. But it was the loft above that changed everything. Tucked behind a hay bale under a board weighed down with stones, they found it. A flat wooden box sealed with wax and wrapped in a torn quilt that bore no name, only a small stitched circle crossed through with black thread. Inside was a thick leather ledger, its pages warped with age and moisture, its spine split from use. The first page was plain. No title, no author, just one line scrawled across the top in jagged script. What festers must be skimmed. The entries began as reflection, almost biblical in tone. It spoke of innocence as milk, of the soul as something suspended within the body like cream on water. It warned that at 13, the skin ripens and rot blooms beneath the rib. The writer, presumed to be Alma Monroe, though never signed, believed that children were only unspoiled before adolescence. Beyond that, they invited corruption by existing. The mind, it claimed, became loud with self. The breath turned acid with want. The soul began to slip, sinking into flesh. The only way to stop it, she wrote, was to intervene before the turning point, before 13. Page after page laid out the rituals. They called it skimming. Each child was to be restrained, silenced, and brought into what she called the hour of stillness. No talking, no sound. The child was made to walk 3 circles counterclockwise, then seated, then emptied. That word, emptied, appeared over and over, sometimes underlined, sometimes written so hard the ink bled through. Elijah, emptied. Ruth, stillness failed. Repeated skimming required. Leah, quiet, clean, obedient, some emptied. Alongside the doctrine were diagrams, crude illustrations of children seated with straight backs, hands tied behind them. Arrows pointed to the throat, the spine, the soles of the feet. She believed these were the exit points for joy, for sin, the body's weakest places, the places where purity slipped out. One note read, "Joy leaks loudest through the toes, bind them flat." Another warned that laughter was a rupture of the spirit wall. And yet another insisted, "Clean souls tremble first. Do not mistake shaking for refusal. It is the soul learning to retreat." In the back of the ledger were the lists, dozens of names, each followed by a date and a verdict. Not alive or dead, just intact or decayed. Those marked as decayed were also marked with symbols, circles crossed through, or a single horizontal line drawn across the name. These children had either resisted the doctrine or festered past rescue. The margins around these entries held frantic notes. One passage read, "Tobias turned 13 before the basin. His voice is thick. His tongue split truth from stillness. He weeps from the back of his throat. Too late, too late, too late." The doctrine was not a rant. It was not chaos. It was structured, numbered, revised over time. A system that had evolved through trial, error, and certainty. Alma had believed what she wrote, believed it down to the way she folded linens, the way she boiled water, the way she held her children's faces between her palms and whispered that they were still good, until they weren't. The ledger closed with a final entry. A short line, centered alone on the last page, the ink fresher than the rest. Daniel, rot surfaced in the eyes. Soul skimmed, room sealed, the doctrine holds. They closed the book and sealed it in evidence, but the pages didn't need to speak again. The damage had already been done. The house had been her chapel, the basement her altar, and the children, one by one, her offering. In the town ledgers, Alma Monroe's name was always written neatly. Mrs. Alma Ruth Monroe, née Granger, teacher, mother, devout parishioner. In the older photographs from church bazaars and school fundraisers, she stood near the back of every group, shoulders square, hands folded, always with that same tight, closed-lip smile, the kind that didn't lift the eyes, the kind that never changed, even when the faces around her did. Everyone remembered Alma as kind, quiet, gentle, the kind of woman who sent thank-you cards no one expected and baked bread with perfect crusts. But the older parishioners, when pressed, began to recall things they hadn't thought of in years. Small things that only began to feel wrong once everything else came to light. They remembered her hymns. Not the usual ones, not exactly. Alma led the Sunday school children in songs she'd rewritten, same words but slower, darker, sometimes in keys that made even the youngest turn their heads. One girl, now grown, said she remembered being told not to hum them at home. "Mama said they felt backwards," she whispered. Another recalled how Alma never used instruments, only voices, soft, repetitive, sung in circles until the room felt smaller. Alma called them purification songs. She claimed they helped drain the noise. Her lessons were focused, strict, no laughter, no questions. She read scripture from memory, but not always in order. She skipped verses, rephrased others. The children were told not to interrupt, One boy asked why Jesus smiled in the paintings, but Alma said the Lord's work wasn't done through smiles. Smiles are masks, she told them. They hide the rot in the teeth. Then she smiled. Always that same smile. When investigators uncovered her personal diary, found behind a false panel in the bedroom wall, they expected notes on meals, chores, maybe the daily worries of motherhood. What they found instead was a system, her thoughts, her judgments, written in stiff, compact lines that wasted no space. She wrote of purity like a farmer speaks of mold, inevitable, dangerous, correctable only by cutting. The first passage said, "Grace must be maintained like fruit in the cellar, checked, trimmed, rewrapped when soft spots show. A soul that bruises will spoil the rest." Another page described her daughter Ruth laughing during supper. Alma called it bubbling rot. She wrote, "Ruth giggled during grace. I drew the joy out through stillness. Her wrists trembled. That's where it hides. I will bind them next time." She believed joy was a threat, that it let something in. Her doctrine, hinted at in both the barn ledger and her diary, wasn't based in punishment but in maintenance. She didn't beat. She skimmed. She didn't scold. She sealed. Her children weren't raised. They were preserved. And she measured their progress not in smiles or milestones but in silence. One chilling entry read, "Elijah hasn't blinked during prayer in 4 days. The cloud lifts. I can see the soul retracting." The townspeople who once admired her began to wonder aloud how they hadn't seen it, how they mistook precision for gentleness, how her quiet became comfort instead of warning. A neighbor remembered watching Alma prune her rose bushes, cutting buds before they opened fully. She said petals spoiled fastest when happy, the woman recalled. She smiled when she said it. That smile became its own kind of omen, a permanent curve that never shifted even when children cried or storms rolled in. Even when asked about the children's sudden absences from school, Alma never changed her tone. "They're being made ready," she'd reply. Ready for what? No one asked. In the final pages of her diary, just before the entries stopped, Alma wrote in smaller, sharper print. Her hand shook more. The thoughts came quicker. One line repeated 3 times. Too much light in Daniel. Too much softness. Must be trimmed before 13. Must be finished before the seed splits. And then nothing. Alma Monroe, remembered by most as soft-spoken and devout, had taught the town's children how to fold their hands, how to close their mouths, how to sing in silence. And no one noticed that she was teaching them to disappear. The woodshed behind the Monroe house had been overlooked at first, its slanted frame swallowed by ivy and the lean of old age. A place for tools, firewood, maybe forgotten things. But when the door was pried open and the scent of rusted metal and sour oil leaked into the air, the search team knew immediately that what lay inside hadn't been forgotten. It had been hidden. The shed was cramped with low beams and rotting boards, and the dust didn't move even when stirred. Every object inside was arranged too carefully to be disuse. The wood was dry, the floor swept. In the farthest corner, beneath a canvas tarp, they found the chair. It was small, child-sized but not fragile. Handcrafted from thick oak, reinforced at the joints, the arms smoothed by time and pressure. It had no cushion, no soft edge, just bare wood worn pale where skin had met it, again and again over years. And the seat. Embedded into the seat, point up in tightly spaced rows, were hundreds of rusted sewing needles. Each one inserted at a precise angle, not hammered but threaded through the wood as if it were cloth. Their tips were dulled with age, many bent, but some still sharp enough to glint when the lantern light passed over them. At first glance it seemed impossible that a child could sit there and survive it. but the pattern of wear said otherwise. The needles were arranged in concentric circles, the center of the seat darkened with stains that had bled into the grain. The wood around them had been sanded smooth over time, the lacquer worn away by years of friction, pressure, stillness. This wasn't a tool of punishment. It was a tool of practice, a place where a child had been made to sit, often for long stretches, with their weight carefully balanced, with no sudden movement, no shift of muscle or nerve. A test of obedience so cruel it disguised itself as discipline. Pinned to the backrest was a scrap of ribbon, blue, sun-bleached and fraying. It had been tied there with care, its knot tight and deliberate. Stitched into the fabric was a name, Ruth. Below it, scratched into the wood, were 4 words, "She sat until clean." The blade marks were shallow but deliberate, not carved by a child, not by someone begging to escape, but by someone who wanted the chair remembered. Beside the chair sat a small basket filled with sewing notions, spools of thread, dull needles, scraps of linen, and beneath it all, a folded note written in tight, mechanical script. It read, "Pain stirs what should not grow. Stillness draws it out. If they can sit, they can be saved." There was no blood left to test, no fresh scent of skin or rot. But what had once happened there remained in the room like a heat that wouldn't leave. One of the deputies crouched low to examine the base of the chair, and when he placed his hand against the underside, he pulled back sharply. Not from pain, but from the feeling. He later described it as pressure, like the air beneath the chair had been compacted, made heavy by the memories of what sat above it. Outside the shed, the sun was setting, but no one moved toward the door. Not yet. Inside, the chair sat untouched, needles waiting as if the ritual had never truly stopped, only paused. They left it there, covered again but not forgotten, knowing no museum would take it, no court would try to explain it. The Monroe children had not been beaten. They had been taught to sit, to bleed in silence, to offer stillness as proof of purity, to balance atop pain so precisely that the wounds would seal under pressure, never breaking skin enough to scream. And that chair, buried beneath wood and time, stood as their quiet confession. Not of rebellion, but of survival, if only for a little while. 12 was not a celebration in the Monroe house. It was a threshold, final, exact, and irreversible. While other children in town marked the year with laughter and candles, the Monroe children were led in silence to the center of the parlor, stripped of their names and prepared for something that could not be undone. Alma wrote about it often. Her diary filled with entries dated to the eve of each child's 12th birthday, always with the same words beneath the name. "Tomorrow the cleansing. May the soul hold still." The rituals followed a pattern. No one was allowed to speak on the morning of the 12th birthday. The child was woken before dawn, dressed in a linen garment stitched without seams. Their shoes were taken. They walked barefoot through the kitchen, over a line of salt poured with perfect precision. At the center of the parlor, white chalk circles had been drawn, 9 in total, each tighter than the last, with a square inside the innermost ring. Symbols marked the spaces between. Crosses bent at odd angles, small loops with dots at their centers, and a single spiral drawn backward. A copper basin stood at the center, set over slow-burning coals. The water inside boiled in silence, a steady breath filling the room. Alma would stand beside it, holding a cloth soaked in vinegar and herbs. The child knelt at her signal, never spoken aloud, only shown with an open palm and 2 blinks of her eyes. The cloth was then pressed to the child's face, not to smother, but to cleanse. To sting. To purify the breath, she claimed, before it could turn sour with adolescence. The room would remain quiet the entire time. No songs, no prayer. only the sound of the water bubbling and the chalk dust settling. The child was made to walk the circles slowly, eyes down, hands folded at the waist. One slip of the foot, one broken line, and the ritual would begin again. The entries in the doctrine ledger described these moments with cold admiration. Leah, still-footed, obedient. No break. Emptied. Tobias trembled at circle 6, remarked the lines, proceeded to silence. After the walk, the child was seated cross-legged on a wool mat and told to hold a small piece of wax in their mouth. Not to chew, not to bite, just to hold. Alma claimed the wax would draw out the warmth of want, a phrase she repeated in multiple entries. Then came the final act, the sealing. A small iron tool, flat at the tip, was pressed to the skin at the base of the child's neck just above the spine. The mark it left was not visible to the casual eye, but on recovered remains, faint scar tissue confirmed something had been done. A brand without fire, a symbol without ink. No voices ever spoke to mark the end. Alma would close the ledger. The chalk would be wiped away. The garment burned in the stove behind the house. That evening, no dinner was served. The child returned to their bed. They did not speak the next day, and if they did, it was noted as failure. Most didn't. Most lay still beneath their quilts, hands tucked beneath the pillow, their breath slowed, their eyes open too long. Every 12th birthday ended the same way. A single line in the ledger. A name. A date. One word. Emptied. No gifts were wrapped, no pictures were taken, only silence remained, wrapped tight around a belief that purity could be preserved through ritual and fear. And inside that house, 12 was not a passage to becoming. It was a ceremony of unmaking. One step too late, one laugh too loud, one question too bold. And the soul, Alma wrote, would sour. Better than to drain it before it had the chance. The testimony came quietly, years after the Monroe property had been sealed, after the journals were archived and the last body carted out beneath canvas. It came not from an official file or a sworn statement, but from a man who'd spent most of his life trying to forget what he saw as a boy. He lived 3 properties over, downwind from the Monroes, close enough to hear the bells of their porch chimes, but far enough that his father told him never to go near. The neighbor's voice shook as he recalled the memory. Not because of what happened, but because of what he'd done in response to it. Nothing. He said there was one Monroe boy, always thin, always barefoot, who would slip out just before midnight, crawling on his stomach beneath the fence boards, dragging a tin pail behind him like it was sacred. He didn't run or look over his shoulder. He just walked straight into the orchard with a spoon clutched in his hand and vanished behind the row of trees. Night after night for months. Sometimes the boy would hum as he dug, quiet, tuneless, broken. Sometimes he didn't dig at all, just knelt over the same patch of earth, whispering to it like it was a person or something worse. The neighbor had never told anyone, not his father, not his teacher, because even as a child he knew he'd seen something the world didn't want to understand. When investigators returned to the Monroe land to follow up on the man's account, they found it, the dirt patch he described. A flat strip of ground beyond the orchard's reach, the soil softer than the rest, loose even after years of storms and frost. They began to dig. 6 inches down, they found the first one. A wooden box the size of a shoe crate, sealed with wax and wrapped in twine. Inside, a bundle of hair tied in red ribbon and a piece of paper torn from a hymnal. The word "please" had been scrawled across it in a child's hand, the ink bleeding through the parchment. Beneath that, another box, then another, 9 in total. Each one held strange combinations, buttons, candle stubs, paper dolls with their eyes scratched out and small bones nestled in cloth. Every item buried with care, every box a secret offering. But the last box changed everything. It was the deepest, wrapped tighter than the rest, sealed not only with wax but with stitching. Inside was a glass jar half filled with cloudy water. Floating within was a child's tooth, clean and white, tied to a scrap of linen that bore a name embroidered in trembling thread: Daniel. Beneath it was a torn page from Alma's doctrine, smudged and warped by moisture. Only one sentence remained legible: "If the soul remains intact, it will not drown in dirt." The conclusion drawn from the evidence wasn't hard to reach. One of the Monroe children had tried to bury the rituals, not figuratively, literally. Daniel, or another like him, had buried what had been taken: hair, teeth, fabric, words. Little pieces of himself and his siblings hidden in the only ground not soaked by doctrine. He wasn't trying to preserve them. He was trying to undo something, or at least hide it from being used again. The dirt patch behind the orchard was not a grave. It was a rebellion. A quiet one, a last attempt by a child to interrupt a cycle so exact it had forgotten to make space for fear. The Monroe house had recorded every ritual in ink. But the orchard soil had recorded something else: resistance. Proof that at least one child knew what was being done to them was wrong. And perhaps that's why Daniel was the last one to be emptied. Because before he was broken, he buried. They found the crates behind the chimney wall. The brickwork was older than the rest of the cabin, uneven, sealed with a kind of mortar that crumbled too easily under pressure, like someone had expected it to be opened again eventually, but not by strangers. Behind the false wall, the cavity was narrow and deep, packed with 3 large crates lined in waxed canvas and stacked neatly, one atop the other. They were heavy but not solid. Inside, layered in straw and cloth, were glass jars. Dozens of them, all identical in size, sealed with corks and thick red wax, each with a thin label wrapped around its middle. The labels bore no dates, no name spelled in full, just pairs of initials, and beneath each set, "Last Exhale." At first, it was assumed to be symbolic, perhaps an old family burial custom, some kind of backwoods ritual meant to preserve memory. But when the first jar was unsealed, the air changed. Not the smell, not the temperature, the air. One of the deputies, young, skeptical, claimed he felt something press against his face, like a gust that came from nowhere and carried nothing. Just the impression of something that had once been breath. The jars appeared empty, but some had faint traces of condensation on the inside glass, as though they had recently held something alive. A few contained the smallest bits of organic debris, ashes, flecks of skin, or what looked like threads soaked in dried saliva. The jars were sent for analysis. A physician from Raleigh was brought in, trained in forensics, experienced in pathology, but unprepared for what he would find. Under microscope and test, the materials defied full explanation. One sample contained traces of epithelial cells, human juvenile. Another showed elevated salt levels consistent with the moisture expelled from lungs in the final moments of breath. The doctor's report stated plainly, these jars were not decorative. They were not metaphor. They were sealed with intent, and they preserved something real. What disturbed investigators more was the consistency. Each jar labeled and positioned with obsessive care. Each wax seal identical. The initials matched known Monroe children, LM, DM, RM, all of whom had disappeared before the age of 13. A pattern that held without exception. The word exhale was never plural, never expanded, always the same, one breath, the last. In Alma Monroe's personal writings, there had been references to air as the vessel of rot, and to purity as something trapped in the breath and loosed at the hour of turning. She had written about the importance of catching the soul before the tongue can shape it, and how children's last exhale held what must never be spoken aloud. No entry detailed the method. None explained how these breaths were harvested. But the implications were clear. The ritual did not end with silence. It ended with containment. The physician refused to take the jars back with him. He labeled his box unclassifiable and returned to Raleigh without finishing his report. Later, in a letter to the county coroner, he wrote, "Whatever she believed she was preserving, it was not symbolic. It was personal. These were not artifacts. They were decisions." Behind the chimney wall, a final inscription had been carved into the wood slats, small and tight, nearly invisible unless searched for. "If their last breath escapes, the rot will find another mouth." And so Alma trapped them, one by one. Not just in body, but in air, in glass, in silence thick enough to hold them forever. The Monroe children were never missed until someone tried to find them. Their names had once appeared on school rosters like any others. Leah Monroe in primary reading, Tobias in arithmetic, Ruth enrolled for penmanship. They arrived on time, never spoke unless called on, turned in clean assignments with no errors and no flair. But sometime after their 11th birthdays, one by one, they simply stopped coming. No formal withdrawals, no transfer records, no sickness reported. The spaces beside their names were left blank, then quietly erased in the next year's ledger. At first, no one questioned it. Some families homeschooled, some just left town. The Monroes, everyone knew, were quiet people, precise, private, the kind you didn't bother unless invited. But after the cabin was searched and the doctrines uncovered and the bodies all but confirmed, investigators returned to the county archives. They pulled the school logs from 15 years back, then 20, then 30. Every Monroe child had been enrolled between the ages of 6 and 10. None had ever completed their 12th year. Not one. The pattern held across decades. Even as teachers changed, principals rotated, and names shifted through the rosters, the Monroe absence repeated like clockwork. And buried in the margins, faded pencil lines hinted at concern that never reached beyond the page. LM stopped attending, no reason given. EM withdrawn, no parent note. Then nothing. The teachers who were still alive spoke cautiously, as if unsure how much of their own memory was truth. One, now retired, remembered Ruth Monroe flinching whenever the recess bell rang. Said her whole body tensed as if bracing for a blow, her hands folding inward. She never smiled, never ran. She often lingered at the edge of the yard, watching other children with a stare that wasn't sad, just still. Like joy was something she had been shown once but never allowed to touch. Another teacher from the year before Tobias vanished recalled him arriving with a bruise that ran from the base of his neck to the tip of his shoulder. He wore long sleeves even in spring. When asked about it, he froze. His only response was, "It was a mistake I made." The teacher said he intended to report it. But Alma pulled Tobias from school the very next day. That was the last anyone saw of him. His name disappeared from the roll that week. When questioned, the school board claimed there had never been cause to investigate. The Monroes had always submitted paperwork when asked, always referenced religious exemption and parental rights. No one wanted to challenge it. In a town where silence passed for respect, their absence was accepted as just another way of raising children. The county clerk, when asked for the files, admitted that half had been lost in a flood. But there had been no flood that year. And still, one box remained, misfiled, forgotten, left to gather dust in a locked drawer. Inside were attendance slips, notes, and a thin, sealed envelope labeled M Discipline Policy. It was unsigned. Inside was a single sheet, handwritten. A chart listing names, birth dates, and a final column marked corrected. In every row, that box was checked beside the child's 12th birthday. Every name belonged to a Monroe, The school never followed up. No teachers ever visited the house, and by the time someone tried to speak, it was too late. Childhood had been erased not by violence, but by paperwork. Tidy, bloodless, final. The Monroes had not hidden their children in the woods. They had hidden them in plain sight, then folded them out of the record, one page at a time. Chapter 11. The Bones in the Well That Wasn't Word Count, 650. Behind the Monroe cabin, where the trees bent inward and the grass refused to grow, there sat a ring of stones in the earth. It looked like an old well, wide, shallow, covered with moss and age. But no bucket lay beside it, no pulley, no signs of use. Just a smooth lid of fitted stone resting atop the circle, sealed tight with packed soil and old wax. At first no one paid it much attention. The house had revealed its horrors. The barn had held its doctrine. The hatch beneath the pantry had given up more than anyone had wanted, but still, something about the ring of stones didn't feel right. It was too deliberate, too clean. The stones had no cracks. The moss grew only around the edges, never over the top. It didn't look forgotten. It looked maintained. The team brought in tools and began the slow, careful work of unsealing it. The top layer lifted like a lid, fitted not with nails, but with tongue-and-groove joints that had been carved by hand. Beneath it was not darkness, not the smell of water or rot. It was dry, packed, and still. The first few inches revealed layers of linen folded and pressed down, stiff with age and dust. Beneath that, bones. They were small, too small. No longer whole, but sorted. Hand bones, wrist bones, ribs the size of fingers. Not shattered, not scattered, but placed. Every layer revealed more, hundreds of them, clean, arranged, no skulls, no femurs, no spines, just fragments, the smallest parts, pieces of children. At first, the forensic team thought it might have been a mass grave, but graves do not organize. Graves do not fold fabric between layers. This was not a burial. This was a container, a collection, the kind of place where something had been put, not laid to rest. And not once, but over time, with care, with intention. Some bones were darker than others, older. Some had markings, small, etched lines as if counted or tallied. Others had been carved with symbols nearly identical to those found in Alma's doctrine. The circle crossed once, the backward spiral, the forked lines. When the earth had given up its last layer, a wooden plaque was found pressed into the base. On it was burned a single phrase: "When the voice is stilled, the body follows." Beneath the plaque, packed into the dirt, was the final offering, a jar. Wax-sealed, unlabeled, containing a strip of parchment with only one word inked in black. Remains. They brought in experts. They measured. They cataloged. The bones belonged to at least 14 individuals, possibly more. All under the age of 13. Some had been cut with surgical precision, no signs of trauma, no signs of struggle, just removal, piece by piece, quiet as ritual, cold as faith. Neighbors recalled that Alma had once said the well behind the house had run dry, that no water had flowed since the last frost of 1819. But there were no records of a well ever dug there, no evidence of one on county maps, only the circle, only the stones, only what lay beneath. Later, a passage was found in Alma's journal, written in smaller script than the rest. It read, "Water rots, dirt preserves, bones speak when voices can't. Let them rest where sound cannot echo." She hadn't buried them to hide them. She'd buried them to seal them, to mute the pieces that remembered too much, to lock silence into flesh. The well was never marked. No stone was placed. The land around it was left to grow wild again. But those who uncovered it never forgot the sound of shovels hitting that dry, packed earth, or the stillness that followed once the last bone was lifted. It wasn't grief. It wasn't relief. It was finality. a silence so deep it felt alive. In the attic above the Monroe bedroom, tucked behind a false panel warped with heat and dust, investigators found a trunk that hadn't been touched in years. It bore no lock, only a rusted clasp and the initials RM carved faintly into its lid. Inside were no clothes, no keepsakes, no trinkets from a childhood past. Only paper. Dozens of pages, some folded into envelopes that had never been sealed. Others flattened, creased with care, written in the same elegant, deliberate hand. Each letter was addressed to the same name, Honorable Judge Malcolm R. Sinclair, Monroe County Court, and every one of them began with the same quiet plea. Please read this before it's too late. They were all written by Rebecca Monroe, the eldest child, the one never spoken of in family records, the one whose school file vanished a year before the rest. Her script was mature, almost adult. Her tone, steady but trembling beneath the lines, held none of the childish errors or simplicity expected from someone her age. These were not ramblings. They were documentation, evidence, warnings. The earliest letter was dated March 3, 1822. In it, she wrote of rules that changed after dusk, that they were not allowed to speak after sunset, that their food was counted and blessed in ways that made her feel less like a girl and more like a thing being prepared. She spoke of her mother, Alma, singing hymns backwards while brushing their hair, of her father, Elias, reading from a book that wasn't the Bible but had its pages bound in black leather soaked through with oil and ash. She begged the judge to send someone, to ask the teacher who'd seen the bruises, to look past the front porch and into the cellar where the air doesn't move and the floor remembers. The second letter came weeks later, this one less hopeful. She wrote that her younger sister Ruth had stopped speaking after her birthday, that she no longer recognized her brother Tobias, that Alma had taken away all the toys and drawings and told them they were idols that held memory where forgetting was needed. Rebecca's words turned darker. She no longer asked to be rescued. She only asked for the judge to remember her name. So if you find the house without us, you'll know we were real. Letter after letter revealed more. The rituals, the doctrine, the purging of rot Alma called divine. Rebecca mentioned the circle behind the house, the one where no sound echoed, where Alma made them kneel in silence after dusk. She wrote of hearing cries below the floorboards, of jars hidden in the chimney, of a birthday ceremony where her brother was told to breathe out everything he was and never speak again. The most harrowing letter was undated, written in a shakier hand. It ended mid-sentence. I think they mean to keep me after... And then nothing. None of the letters were ever sent. No postage, no witness. Just a child writing her own testimony into the void, hoping someone somewhere would hear. It's believed she hid the trunk herself, possibly in the final days before her disappearance, possibly the night her name was last called in school and never again after. In the courtroom years later, when charges were drafted against the Monroe lineage, a copy of Rebecca's first letter was read aloud. The judge presiding paused mid-reading, overcome. He was the grandson of the man those letters were meant for. He said afterward, "They weren't just letters, they were lifelines, and we never reached back." Rebecca's letters never saved her, but they condemned what silence had protected. They became the voice of all the children who couldn't write, couldn't ask, couldn't scream loud enough to be heard past the chapel hymns and cellar doors. And when the trial ended and the land was cleared, the trunk was placed in the county archive, sealed in glass. Beneath it, a plaque reads, "She wrote to be seen. Let her be." In the months that followed the final excavation, the Monroe property stood guarded by silence. Deputies took shifts without orders. No one wanted to be the one to say the land was clear. The trees leaned too close, the dirt never softened, and the air, even in spring, held the stale breath of something that had waited too long to be spoken aloud. By then, over a dozen children's remains had been identified in part or in name. Jars of exhaled breath had been confirmed by physicians. Journals, doctrine, handmade devices of harm, all real, all documented. And yet, when the case reached the state's highest courts, no single soul stood trial. No living Monroe remained to bear the weight of justice. Alma had died months before the first child was found. Elias had vanished entirely, never seen again after the boy with the bleeding hands was taken into custody. Whatever he knew, he took with him, leaving behind only paper, silence, and rot. But something had to be done. The press called it a shame that bled into law. The people called it something else entirely, a curse. Behind closed doors, officials from 3 counties met to draft what would become the Child Endangerment and Custodial Oversight Act of 1831. It was one of the first of its kind, a law meant not just to punish after the fact, but to prevent. It mandated county-wide attendance checks for all children under 15. It required teachers to report not just absence, but patterns, bruises, flinches, changes in behavior. It gave counties the right to inspect properties if children were withdrawn from school without cause. For the first time, North Carolina acknowledged that not all families were safe by default. That harm didn't always wear the face of a stranger. Sometimes it came with hymnals and clean porches and baked bread cooling in the window. But even as laws shifted, the town of Calhoun refused to speak the Monroe name. They didn't hold a vigil. They didn't build a memorial. They didn't preserve the house for evidence. In August of that same year, the land was quietly condemned. One by one, town officials and neighboring farmers came together, not to honor what had happened, but to erase it. The house was torn down in a single day. The boards burned, the ashes scattered in the field where the boy had once stumbled barefoot and broken. The cellar hatch was filled with stone, the false well crushed under layers of lime. Nothing marked the space anymore. Nothing told the story unless you already knew how to look. And so, no one was held accountable. No charges were ever filed. The evidence sat locked in a state archive, sealed in humidity-controlled drawers, visited only by historians and students chasing footnotes. The children's names were not chiseled into stone, their ages not read aloud in court. Even the surviving boy, whose hands had once bled through winter grass, disappeared into the care of a distant family, his identity sealed, never released again. Survivorship didn't come with comfort. It came with silence, mandated cold and long. There was one final attempt to prosecute nearly 30 years later. A grandchild of one of the attending deputies petitioned to reopen the case, citing unreleased names in Alma's doctrine ledger. But the judge declined. Justice, he said, cannot walk where memory refuses to follow. And in that refusal, the Monroe house ceased to exist in the eyes of law. But the law itself remained. That act, passed in 1831 and later adopted by neighboring states, would go on to influence how schools, courts, and communities viewed the care of children for generations. In every line of that statute, there's a trace of what was found behind the pantry, beneath the stones, and folded into letters that were never sent. The law carried their breath, even if their names did not. And in Calhoun, there's a field that no one plows, not by rule but by understanding. The grass there never grows right. The birds don't rest on the fence posts. People pass it without looking. It's not marked on any map. But every so often a stranger comes and stops there, as if feeling something through the soles of their shoes. And though no one says the name Monroe out loud, the land does. Quietly, unrelentingly,